Hello folks, this is Tennyson E Stead, writer and director of Quantum Theory, founder of 8-Sided Films. Welcome back to the 8-Sided blog. And today I'd like to talk a little bit about the release of Star Wars: The Force Awakens, and a subject that's been sort of bandied about in independent film circles in Hollywood very rigorously for the last couple of years at least, which is the subject of how much of our craft Hollywood has forgotten and left behind as digital cinema has developed. Obviously, the fact that J.J. Abrams is doing so much of The Force Awakens practically in terms of the special effects and sets and everything else that he's building is of interest to the fan community and the Hollywood community. And one of the things that I've focused on in my own work, and one of the things that I've wanted to sort of bring to light in Hollywood, is the fact that over the course of Hollywood's development over the last 25 or 30 years, special effects is not the greatest loss that we've suffered in terms of our ignorance of how the craft was performed and how the craft was actually exercised up until now. And specifically, I want to bring attention to how we look at the performing arts and how we look at acting today versus how we looked at it 30, 40 years ago, and how our views on acting 30, 40 years ago were grounded in centuries of creative development and centuries of expansion as an industry that we've sort of let slide because so many people in Hollywood today came from other industries and they don't necessarily have, like I was saying in our previous blog, the habits. In particular, they don't have the habits of show business that get drilled into you when you're raised in the performing arts. And it all pertains to risk. It all pertains to how we manage the threat of failure. And in particular, when you look at a lot of the films today in terms of how they're cut and how they're written, the objective is to make sure that the story is one that you can afford to screw up in terms of casting and one that you can afford to screw up in terms of performance so that you can go in and build something for the audience in post. Basically, as a result, every single shot that we see is designed to get one thing out of an actor. Now, what we've stopped doing throughout this process basically is asking actors to do two or more things at once. We've stopped asking actors to, for example, perform a piece of action in terms of like maybe it's a tense thriller and they're trying to chase somebody down, and we won't ask the actor to run down the corridor and chase this person down while at the same time committing in such a way that the stakes of the situation are communicated through their running. Instead, we take a shot, we have the actor look down the hall very tensely and very deliberately, and then we have a second shot where they take off running so that we know as they start to run just how much it means to them. Problem is, that's not how life works. When you chase someone, you don't hesitate if the situation warrants immediate action. You dive right in, you commit to it, and your commitment is how people know you're in the middle of a dire circumstance. What we need to do is reevaluate how we communicate intention and how we communicate stakes and how we communicate a story, not so much in terms of shot by shot feeding the elements of that story to an audience, but in terms of looking directly at the action and how the character performing that action is expressed in all their complexity. Let's see if I can be a little more specific and a little bit more clear about that statement. So, there's a couple of things that we need to bring back in order to make this process work. First of all, when we write a screenplay, we need to stop feeding the audience all the details piece by piece. We need to cut out all the exposition and focus exclusively on the very specific actions a character needs to perform to accomplish their goal. And then, as we write those actions, we have to make sure that the actions are extreme enough to reflect the reasons why that character is trying to perform that goal. So for example, if we have a cop trying to catch a criminal, and if we know that that cop's reason for catching that criminal is intensely personal and it involves, various cases they've been involved in the past, they've been trying to catch this person for years, then, when they see that criminal, the thing that tells us that it's incredibly important that they catch him is that they stop whatever they were doing before, immediately, like without hesitation, without even thinking about it, they just go. and they run down. They don't give that criminal a chance to see them. They just, boom, right out of the gate. They chase them down as fast and hard as they can. They shove people out of their way, and they go straight at the criminal. And then the criminal, understanding that they're about to get caught, is not going to take a moment to glance longingly at the police officer, intensely debating whether or not this is as urgent as they think it is. They're just going to run. We need to rehearse. We need to rehearse those actions so that the actor, as they take off down the street, has the opportunity to work in all the reasons why they're chasing them and make them second nature. If we just take one take and we have that person running, we're going to get a shot of a person running down the street. Whereas if we get them used to the running and accustomed to the action itself, so that the action is not something that they have to be thinking about as they're actually performing it, then as they chase that person, they can be thinking instead about all the things they're going to do to that person when they catch them. You know what I mean? Once the safety issues of running down a corridor are handled, once the actor knows where their marks are and where their beats are and where the camera's going to be, because it's in their body, they can focus on all the reasons why they have to catch this person and what's at stake, and then those realities become reflected on the actor's face. So we don't need the shot before telling us how intense the situation is. It's completely irrelevant and actually redundant if we do the work of rehearsing. The other thing we have to do as we break down this workload is we have to put in the script the efficiency and the intensity that the actors actually need to take actions that seriously. If we put in baby step-by-step sort of, spoon-fed, moment after moment, tiered access to the stakes of a story, then we're not asking anything of the actor. We're basically writing a role that anyone can come in and perform, because the emotional leaps that you have to make and the multitasking that you have to undertake as a performer to actually do the thing that's on the page is completely undemanding. Now, the reason why we write those roles is because most people in Hollywood don't really have a solid grasp of the casting process to begin with. So, we make it easy on casting directors, and then we make it easy on the actors that the casting directors feed us by making a script as accessible to a performer as we possibly can, when in reality, in order to make our performance as acutely spectacular, and we're going to talk about spectacle in just a second, as acutely as spectacular as we can, we actually have to demand a lot more of the performer on the page than most actors are actually capable of giving. And that introduces a screenplay to all kinds of risk, because the person who's reading the screenplay, who's maybe going to buy it, might not be enough of a performing artist to see what's on the page and understand how much is happening in those few lines. You see what I'm saying? And then on top of that, you run the risk of not finding the actors who can actually do the job and winding up with a failing performance. Now, just like with the special effects, just like with all the other things that Hollywood has been slowly letting slide over the last 10 or 20 years, the reason why we don't do all these things is because so much can go wrong and because we can lose the movie in the process, and nobody wants to see that. The advantage to doing all this work is that we wind up with something much more spectacular and much more noteworthy on the screen. And what I mean by spectacular is literally the same thing I mean when I refer to a giant big budget blockbuster movie as spectacular. Spectacle, ultimately, is what you get. It's the experience of witnessing a person do something that you didn't know people could do. The first time they blew up Alderaan on the screen, it was amazing because nobody had any idea that special effects were capable of that. And ultimately we were watching the special effects team of Star Wars do something that nobody had any reason to expect they could do. For that reason, it just went right into people's heads, and it stayed there because it was a surprise. And you can teach audiences to anticipate bigger special effects, and we have over the last 20 or 30 years. And you can teach audiences also to expect more clever plot twists. That's something we've also been very good at, very thorough with. But audiences will always underestimate the craftsmanship of other human beings. We always give each other the short shrift. And if you pour the time and attention into challenging actors with performances that they might not be able to give, and then you take the time of finding actors who are actually capable of of taking that challenge and moving things one step further and doing more than you thought could be done with the material on the page, and then, with the efficiency and the time that you're actually giving yourself from shot to shot, from the actual, basically the shot list, then when you wind up in the editing room, you're going to have an abundance of emotion and complexity and layers and depth. And that is going to fuel the spectacle in all other aspects of what you're doing. Now, how this pertains to quantum theory is tied up in the fact that the performance style we're working with is highly technical. When you get right down to it, we're working with a lot of the same comic beats that Neil Simon worked with in New York theater. And ultimately, it's about making sure that the jokes and the humor and the humanity of each and every individual moment lands 1 second earlier in the audience's experience than they're anticipating, which means they get caught by surprise instead of realizing, hey, there's supposed to be a comic beat here. Oh, there it is. You see what I'm saying? We beat them to the punch, and we maintain our spectacle by not just getting there first, but by then delivering a moment of action. The goal of the story is being realized in that moment, so the audience already has something to focus on, but with so many layers of humanity and so many layers of humor and stakes and all the things that these characters are actually experiencing in their lives, delivered through the performers, that the audience is consistently blown away and surprised from moment to moment to moment by what they're seeing and by their connection to what they're seeing. That's where the humanity comes from. That's where the layers come from. And it starts on the page. It starts by putting each and every moment there very specifically because it ties into what these characters are trying to accomplish and for no other reason. And then by allowing those characters to express their humanity and the complexity of their motivations and everything else, through those actions, giving them opportunities to make each and every moment of that action theirs, instead of just it being there for the sake of the story. And then casting people who can deliver even more depth than what's on the page, and then rehearsing them and rehearsing them and rehearsing them until all the mechanics of that are handled and intuitive, and it's up to them to focus on their motivations while we perform the actions so that the layers are present for the audience. And then by the time we get into the editing room, what we have is a lot of really hard choices between, excellent moments instead of the struggle of piecing together a movie that people actually want to watch. And then after that, you bring in a composer who delivers a whole nother layer of depth. You don't say, hey, punch this up. Hey, tell the audience how to feel about this or that. Instead, you bring in your post-production team to introduce new themes and new depth. And they're all centered around the action, so the depth isn't out of place. It's just an element of what you're seeing that is not capable of being shot on the camera. To bring up Star Wars, it's the scale and the scope. That's what you can't possibly have in front of a camera in 1976 and 1977, is the fact that there's a whole universe, that it's legit. John Williams brought that. And, I look forward to providing our composer on quantum theory, Dan Haggerty, with a similar challenge. Once all that work is done and you have a finished film, what you've got is cinema as well as entertainment. And to me, it all boils down and it all starts with the performances and bringing that craft back into the spotlight and bringing the casting and the writing for actors and the rehearsal process, what actors actually do, bringing that back into focus in Hollywood is a big part of what excites me creatively about quantum theory. That is a much longer blog than I intended to give you, but I hope everybody found it interesting. I'm going to sign off, and I'll be back with more 8-sided blogs in the very near future.